North American perspectives on the appropriation of archaeological heritage. Christiane Gates-Saint-Pierre, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mr. Mart. Thank you very much to the organizers as well for organizing this symposium. It's a great honor to be here with you. Very stimulating presentation throughout the day yesterday, and I was very, very pleased to be a part of it. I'm convinced that today will be just as stimulating. Please forgive me for my accent. I apologize also to the interpreters for my Canadian accent, says the speaker. So my presentation, the ideas that I will be talking about are not new. These are ideas and issues that archaeologists have been mulling over for many, many years. I do not intend to provide an exhaustive or definitive answer, just to introduce a few reflections from across the Atlantic on these issues, and maybe to highlight some of the issues and problems that are raised. I hope that this presentation can feed into further discussions and comparisons between French and North American approaches to this discussion of the past. So let me open with a question. Aside from the question, who owns the past, we can say who owns archaeological heritage. This is one of the aspects of the past. Once again, there are a number of possible answers to this question, and I would like to examine a few potential answers with you to see where we are in terms of archaeology and in North America. It is a particularist, even a capitalist approach in Canada and the US, the archaeological sites and the collections that they contain. One possible answer says that, well, they are owned by whoever owns the land, be it a public authority or a private owner, and it depends on the legislation, American, Canadian legislation. So anything that the land contains is the property of the landowner, whoever that may be. According to a second answer to this question, the heritage it belongs to the nation. This is the case of France, for example, as we heard yesterday. A number of other nation states hold the same interpretation. Archaeological heritage, countries that have very rich, very dense heritage, Greece and a number of other countries, for example, have this interpretation in their legislation. This is not the case in the US and North America, except for a few rare exceptions, as I will explain later. Some take an identitarian approach, and they attribute archaeological heritage to the descendants of indigenous communities, and such as, for example, the indigenous communities, without dispossessing them as they have been done in the past for a whole series of regions, but rather as part of an attempt to allow them to reappropriate their own history. And finally, another answer to this question is part of a more humanist approach, an international approach, and that says that at least some of it, if not all of it, belongs to humanity as a whole. This is the principle that underpins the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. This is the case in France, in Canada, in the US. It is some of this heritage that is shared across the whole of humanity, is not necessarily systematic. So let us now look at indigenous communities. They are found in specific contexts, and they have an administrative system, a legal system that perpetuates the colonial enterprise in some way, because they are dispossessed of their territory and of their archaeological heritage. They are limited in North America to indigenous reserves. Sometimes we call them native Indian reserves, which is a little bit of a problematic term for us. But you can see here a map of Canada and the US, and you can see there the little plots of land that have been colored in. They are restricted. They're not confined. They're not forced to live in these reserves, but they are often confined, so they are restricted. And secondly, these territories are subject to federal jurisdiction, which means that the land belongs to the federal government and the resources within them, be they natural resources or archaeological resources, also belong to the federal state. In some cases, it may be possible to enable indigenous communities to possess the archaeological context and the resources, but at any rate it is not enshrined in Canadian law, and so this poses a problem. We must also remember that the archaeological sites discovered in North America are, majority are indigenous sites, roughly 60%, and mainly it is, however, non-indigenous communities and institutions and individuals who carry out the excavations. The mediation and research done on these sites is also carried out by non-indigenous individuals. Another issue is that the collections and those who interpret the history of indigenous communities sometimes are contradictory to the indigenous beliefs and interpretation. And so there is this area of tension that emerges between the discourse of indigenous people on their own past and that of archaeologists on the past of these same indigenous peoples. And this is an area that I would like to explore a little further in the next few minutes. So in a context of decolonization of archaeology and reappropriation of the past by indigenous peoples, these are key concepts. I don't really want to go into neo-Marxist approaches or subaltern approaches or theoretical approaches that try to explain or that have enabled the emergence of these movements. I don't think that this is particularly relevant or interest, so we will put that to one side, even though it could be interesting. I would like to focus on four key points: that these movements of decolonization and reappropriation of indigenous peoples and that underpin them. So the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, which was briefly mentioned yesterday, was instituted in 1990. And it is the federal institutions that forces, so this law forces federal institutions that receiving any institution receiving funds from a federal body, any museum, any university receiving federal funding is subject to this law. So a lot of institutions, both public and private, are subject to this law and thus have an obligation to draw up a list of archaeological remains that they own and to return them to the autonomous, to the indigenous communities. So human remains, burial objects, sacred objects, and cultural heritage objects. This is a very vague and rather broad notion, which can also be problematic. So it is precise and restrictive. The Canadian government does not have this law, or a similar law, in fact, but in a rather proactive way implements the same kind of process of restitution of collections to indigenous communities. It doesn't do it systematically, and it is certainly done to a lesser degree than in the United States, but it is done even though there is not a law obliging us to do so. In the department where I teach, we had decided to draw up a list of human remains in our laboratory and to present this list to the indigenous communities concerned and to undertake a process of restitution of these items to the to the indigenous communities. There is no as I say, there is no rule that forces us to do so, but because of our ethical beliefs, we felt that it was the right thing to do and have undertaken this action. However, it is not as simple as all that. There are some issues that arise. For example, the Kenwick Man case. The body of an 8,000-year-old man found on the west coast of the US. It's very difficult with something of that age. It's very difficult to identify which group this person belonged to, whether he was Iroquois or Algonquin or of another group. So who do you have to return the remains to? There is still a debate ongoing, by the way, about the Kenwick Man. So this is one issue. Another problem is determining whether artifacts do have a sacred dimension or not, and so we may wonder whether an item needs to be returned according to the criteria listed on the screen. And then, as I said, this vast, vague category of cultural heritage objects. To what extent, what is included in this category? Well, pretty much anything could be included in this category. But at any rate, despite all of these issues, things happened fairly straightforwardly. There weren't a lot of problems, but there are issues in terms of the interpretation of archaeological artifacts. To move on, ethical and legal prudence with this dimension, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which contains a number of articles affecting archaeology more specifically, in particular 11.1, which states that indigenous people have the right to conserve, protect, and develop past, present, and future symbols of their culture, such as archaeological sites. 11.2 states should repatriate through appropriate and effective mechanisms the restitution, anything that was taken from indigenous communities without their prior consent or in violation of their laws, traditions, or customs. And finally, Article 12.1 on indigenous peoples as well. They have the right to use their ritual objects or to have access to repatriation of human remains. Of course, the point of all of these declarations is to encourage, to facilitate the autonomy of indigenous communities and to allow them to reappropriate their history and their past. I have to add that the United States has, after many long years of hesitation, has signed up to this declaration. In Canada as well. So now they must adapt we must adapt our national legislation to take into account these laws. The third point is the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada from 2015 to try and repair the harm done to Indigenous communities in the past. It also recommends greater funding to archaeological research for scientific research in general, but also specifically to archaeological research. It should be done for and by indigenous communities. So not only research into indigenous communities, but actually by these people themselves. which is not necessarily very easy. To give you an example, I was on the jury of the Council of Research that attributes scholarships and funding, and we established a list of criteria that had to be considered, and one of the criteria was conformity with the recommendations of this commission. So we had to take into account these considerations, these criteria, when attributing research grants. So this point on indigenous communities. I have only 5 minutes. So, final point, ethical codes, just very, very quickly, to say that there are a series of ethical codes in North America, and in fact, all of them make reference to practices adopted as regards indigenous communities. There is even an annex to one of these, the ACA, which specifically addresses behavior and practices that should be used by archaeologists when working with and for indigenous communities. So what does this actually mean in concrete terms? What does this mean, the decolonization of North American archaeology, adopting a reflexive and collaborative approach to our activity? What this means is that we try to integrate indigenous communities in our processes. It's not just about asking for authorization or consulting indigenous communities, but really involving them in the whole process from the beginning until the end, from the design of the project right through to implementation. It doesn't always happen, but this is an ideal that we are aiming for. Next, archaeology must adapt. Archaeologists must recognize that they don't have a monopoly on discourse on the past of indigenous peoples. We should recognize also that it is a monopoly that we have had up until now, but it is now time to include the voice of indigenous peoples on their past. This leads to a multivocal approach and the consideration of other forms of knowledge and co-construction on the past of these people. And this is all intended to enhance the reappropriation of the past and heritage by indigenous peoples. This does not mean, however, that we should not continue to maintain scientific rigor in these approaches, and there may be oppositions, contradictions, tensions between our ways of understanding and interpreting the past. Over the next 3 or 4 minutes, I will try to abandon my notes and to talk about an example that is happening now in the St. Lawrence Valley, the Iroquoians. These are one of the group of Iroquoian languages and cultures. Iroquois and Iroquoian are not exactly the same, but it is part of the overall Iroquois group. There are a number of other groups included in this family, and you can see them there highlighted in brown on the map. And one of these subgroups is shown there in the blue ring. The Iroquoian have been identified by anthropologists, ethno-linguistic information and others. This people has disappeared or been scattered around and mixed into other groups following the arrival of Europeans. And this land was therefore left vacant for a certain amount of time before being reoccupied by other groups, the Iroquois, the Huron-Wendat, the Alcuins, and the Abenakis. And these two of these groups maintain that the Iroquoian were never a group, did not exist, that is an invention of archaeologists and anthropologists, and are claiming that they represent the Iroquoian of Saint Laurent. So there are clashing discourses on this, whereas there are archaeological artifacts that clash with the oral tradition. So how can this be managed? How can this be managed? Can they be complementary? What do we do with this issue? We have to live with it, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, but it is very interesting, challenging, and stimulating. Now, this matter became rather more complicated in 2017 during the municipal elections, the elections for mayor. The former mayor that you see there, and Valérie Plante, the new mayor, the only female mayor, the only female archaeologist who is a mayor. She trained with us, by the way. But both of these had took a stand on this question, and this actually did have political consequences. Montreal is in a former indigenous region, and so they all called on archaeologists, anthropologists, historians, and so on. And archaeology became a subject of media interest, and there was a debate about the different voices, the contradictory interpretations, not necessarily confrontational, but different interpretations were present. So I must draw my conclusion. Well, this film, the director of this film also took a stance. François Gérard, for those of you who don't know it, he made a number of other films. But anyway, this to celebrate a significant anniversary of the city of Montreal, Terre des Âmes, the land of souls. So, just very quickly then, sometimes archaeology can be relevant to society. It can be involved in social debates and even have political consequences. And so this question of reappropriation by indigenous communities and reinterpretation by indigenous communities of their past is very much a contemporary issue. Thank you very much.